Hello and welcome to Bags of Action. My name is Pete and this is a 5-minute Bags of Action review of Payback Straight Up from 2006, which is the director's cut version of the original Payback, which came out in 1999. Now, this is the first time I've watched the director's cut specifically for the show, having also seen the original before, so I'm going to mainly be focusing on the differences between the two movies. So ideally, you would be coming to this having at least seen the first version. So back in 1999, I was ridiculously excited about Payback when it was announced. It marked the directorial debut of screenwriter Brian Helgeland, whose work I had loved on LA Confidential and also on a film called Conspiracy Theory. And Payback saw him teaming up with Conspiracy Theory star Mel Gibson, who was on a roll after the Lethal Weapon movies, Ransom, Braveheart, and the underrated Maverick movie. So, one of my favourite writers, one of my favourite at the time actors, coming together to do my kind of movie. Payback is based on The Hunter, a novel by Donald E. Westlake under the pseudonym Richard Stark, which was the first, I think, of 23 Parker novels, many of which have been made into movies, though usually without the Parker name used. The other adaptation of this novel is Point Blank from 1967, starring Lee Marvin, which I've also seen, and the most recent Parker movie, which actually used the name Parker, starred Jason Statham, but that was based on a different book of the series and is best not discussed. So what is Payback all about? Well, interestingly, the IMDb entries for the original film and for this director's cut are slightly different. So the original film says, after a successful heist, Porter is shot by his wife and his best friend. They leave him there to die, but when he recovers, he seeks revenge and wants his share of the money. So the subtle difference in the director's cut is Porter is shot by his wife and best friend and is left to die. When he survives, he plots revenge. So it's a lot tighter, a lot tauter, less information given, and that pretty much sums up this version. So alongside Mel Gibson, who else is in the cast? It's a great set of actors. Bill Duke, Maria Bello, Gregg Henry, David Paymer, Lucy Liu, James Coburn, Deborah Unger, amongst others. And you may notice, if you've seen the original, I didn't mention Chris Christopherson because he doesn't appear in this version. So, back when the original version came out, I wasn't 100% sure what to make of it. It had some hard-boiled, gritty elements, alongside scenes that felt that they came from a much bigger action movie franchise. Now, I didn't know at the time the reason it felt slightly off-kilter was because this film had poor test screenings with the original version. Helgeland was asked to do rewrites, but he wouldn't, so he left the project. And then they did some extensive reshoots, and they rewrote approximately a third of the film and changed it from the original script and the novel, which explains a lot. Because not only was Mel Gibson the star, he was also the producer of the film, as his company Icon was making the movie. And those rewrites, he brought in Terry Hayes, who he knew because he'd done 2 of the original Mad Max movies. Essentially, the third act of this film is completely new. So it really took a bit of time on this second watch to get my head around that fact. So in essence, there are actually 3 versions of this film. There's the cut that had the test screenings that didn't do very well. There's the theatrical version with those massive changes. And this third one is something new again, because Helgeland went back to this film 7 years after the original was released and made more changes. So with no studio interference at all, he could make his vision even clearer and much darker. The same editor did all 3, which I can't quite get my head around how you'd be able to do that, but obviously a good collaborator there with Helgeland. So when I first saw it, I thought it was half typical, half edgy. This version is all edgy. So, the original version, much more mainstream and accessible. There's a voiceover at the start which explains things to the audience, which I always hated. Really spells things out. There's a big bad added, which is Chris Christopherson's character, Bronson, who wasn't in the original script. There's a much more traditional third act added with a typical rising narrative. It's much more linear. It's just much more mainstream, which is why it doesn't quite work. So this version, it's much more oblique. In the extras, Helgeland talks about it having more of a 70s film vibe, which is very true. The original version has like a blue sheen to it. This one's got a bit more of a bleached out look, but story-wise, it's much darker, much more noir. Porter, the version of Parker, beats up his wife early in the film after she tried to kill him. Now, that scene wasn't in the original movie because it's a difficult thing to put on camera and something that people don't like and don't want to see. The other thing is, because the structure of the original film, if you had kept that scene in, you'd have known that his wife had tried to kill him and there would have been a reason for his actions. Here, you see this before because you don't actually know that his wife and his best friend tried to kill him until you start seeing the flashbacks, which again is rewarding an intelligent audience rather than spoon-feeding them, which tends to be the Hollywood way often and is how the theatrical cut went. Porter's code is much clearer in this version. You kind of get more of a sense of him as a character. And the ending is much more ambiguous, which I really like, as I say, because that final act is completely different. The score has been revised. And I think Bronson's character being brought into the theatrical cut just made it much more of a moving your way up through the different people in the organisation, whereas this version is much more about this man who's just determined to get his cut of the money and basically just to get his revenge and to live by his code. So what did I think of it? I preferred this version to the original, definitely, but there are still some flaws, but I don't know, maybe they wouldn't be noticeable if I wasn't coming to this film 20 years after it was made or having seen a version already. You know, I owned the original on DVD, I now own this one on Blu-ray. So somewhere between the two, I think there's a really good film, and I'm still longing for a definitive movie or TV version of the character Parker, who I love from the novels and also from the Darwin Cook graphic novel adaptations. Now, despite the backing of his mentor, Richard Donner, leaving this project could easily have ended Brian Helgeland's directorial career and seen him return to just being a screenwriter. But he's actually gone on to direct quite a few more films, like A Knight's Tale, which was very successful, and the Craig twins film adaptation Legend. And I'm really pleased that this film is getting a home video release at the very least, as to kind of give him some sort of closure. So in this version, Mel Gibson's performance seems much better. It's much darker. The Porter character is much more ruthless, and I think that plays to his strengths. And the story challenges the audience more like a 70s movie, as I say. I actually felt much more invested in this version. Taking all of that into account, I'm going to give Payback Straight Up 3 bags of action. It didn't quite merit 4 bags, unfortunately, but I would highly recommend seeing this film. If you haven't seen either film, maybe go straight into this one cold, and you can have the proper experience that Helgeland wanted for you. But if you have seen the original, and particularly like me, if you're interested in process, it's well worth watching just to see those changes. So, if you have already seen Payback Straight Up, do you agree with my assessment of it? Feel free to comment below or get in touch with us via email, Facebook or on Twitter. We have new episodes coming out regularly alongside, don't forget, our full-length podcast with me and my co-host. And don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel.